Yasmin asks, if I consume too much protein, will this be converted into fat?
Good question. I would say yes. It's typically not the protein itself, though, that is actually converted into fat, but rather that excess energy intake from a high protein diet does still contribute towards fat gain. So there have been a few studies by Antonio et al., which found no increase in fat gain.
Yeah.
They were free living conditions, though, with very high protein intakes, very high dropout rates, very poor dietary adherence. And I've talked to him about these studies, and he also says, yeah, a lot of people complained about digestive issues, about just not being able to get in that much protein. So I think in this case, over-reporting is actually quite likely, that they were saying, yes, I got all my protein in. When in reality, they were like, nah, I'm done. At the end of the day, do I need to do another 2 whey shakes before I go to bed? I'm not doing it, sorry. But they log it as, yes, did it today. If you look at controlled research, like the Bray et al. Metabolic wart studies, they do find that higher energy intake or higher protein intakes, all else equal, just increase the protein intake, you do see higher fat brain gains. And mechanistically, the body does oxidize protein very readily as energy source. And that frees up carbohydrates or fat, typically fat, to be stored as fat. So there's the mechanistic confusion, because people think, oh, you don't store the surplus of energy directly as fat. And that's true. What happens is the body oxidizes the protein, uses it for energy, and then it uses less carbohydrate or fat for energy, because it has a protein already that's generating the energy. So it will store more of the fat. The body's typically very efficient. It will preferentially store the fat as fat, because it's the easiest, most metabolically efficient pathway. And only then, if needed, convert glucose to new fat, de novo lipogenesis. And protein has to kind of do a dual pathway of first the glucose and then de novo lipogenesis. Very inefficient, so the body doesn't do it. But it's only relevant if you're literally consuming nothing but protein. And that's typically not the case. So in practice, yes, increasing your protein intake can increase fat gain. I mean, the body doesn't even know what the surplus is that you eat. It just registers energy.
And do you think a similar misconception comes from, at least in my experience, I've spoken with clients and even a couple of athletes that have gone on a ketogenic diet and not managed to lose much body fat because they've misconstrued oxidizing fat with burning or losing body fat. Whereas if you're kind of overfeeding fat, then your body is going to preferentially use that for energy. It's not necessarily just going to dip into the fat store. So similar thing with protein and overconsumption. Ultimately, if you consume too much of anything, the body's going to find a way of storing that in tissue stores.
Yes, that's the confusion between your body turning into a fat burning machine, which might be true in terms of fat oxidation rates, but it's not necessarily true in terms of adipose tissue loss.
And with the protein consumption, do you think some of that, those kind of questions on if I ever eat protein, I can't gain fat, is that through maybe a mis-exaggeration of dietary induced thermogenesis from protein intake, in that people think they're getting a sort of a freebie of just consuming as much as they want?
Definitely. And we have quite some research on that. It does seem to be true that very high protein intake has a dietary induced thermogenesis advantage compared to lower protein diet. So it's inefficient for the body to store the protein as fat. Usually that's not an issue because you also consume fat and the like, but there's also a greater increase in energy expenditure from high protein foods because they have a naturally high thermic effect of food. So it takes more energy to absorb and digest the nutrients. And especially if you're not at an optimized protein intake yet, then you're also increasing muscle protein synthesis. And that significantly increases energy expenditure because it just makes the whole body more metabolically active. So up until that point of maximum muscle growth, you should also see better fat loss because you're stimulating increased energy expenditure. Above that point, you only have the thermic advantage, assuming that you're not on a zero fat, zero carb diet. So literally just whey shakes all day. Even then you have some carb intake. So the thing with that is that when people say, oh, look, we have these studies by Antonio, and they don't look at the Bray studies, they say, well, the higher protein, there's thermic advantage, so you don't get fat gain. The thing is, the thermic advantage is always a percentage of energy intake. So it's literally there's no such thing as negative energy, right? If you consume 100 calories, and even if you go by the highest estimates of protein being like 30% thermic effect, you're talking about 30 calories extra burned out of those 100. So you still have 70 additional calories that are going to be stored in the body. So it's impossible to explain zero fat gain. Like you could say there is reduced fat gain. Most research finds that that's true, but it's marginal. We're talking about small differences. But you cannot logically infer from that there would be zero fat gain.